afternoon, everyone. I'm Diana. I'm from 17 Asset Management. We're one of the sponsors behind this great event. Welcome to your last session of day one. Thank you for spending your whole afternoon with us. If you've been here the whole time, if you're just jumping in, welcome. Glad to have you here. So we're really excited to have you for today's presentation. And before I turn it over, I'd like to introduce some of our speakers to you for today. And I'll also kind of go through a couple of the housekeeping items if you haven't seen these already. Just a few things. Please use the chat feature to send me any of your questions that you might have during the session. Feel free to carry on a conversation, comment on the topics we're talking about. Give us your point of view. We'd love to hear from you. In the same area as the chat, you'll also see some polls that might pop up. So feel free to give an answer to those, check out the links, and see whatever else is being set in there. And if you have any further questions, feel free to send them to me. Again, you'll see my name is in there as Diana, so you can just send them to me directly. And so without further ado, I'll hand it over to Sabrina from Generocity to begin our session.
Hi, welcome to Inclusive Communities. I'm Sabrina Vourvoulias, the editor of Generocity. With me here are Pedro Ramos from the Philadelphia Foundation, Andrew Frishkoff from LISC Philadelphia, Sharmain Matlock-Turner from the Urban Affairs Coalition, and Michael O'Brien from the Village of Arts and Humanities. Hello, everybody. I wanted to jump in, talk a little bit about the first question that that is on the website is, you know, how can we make the new normal an inclusive one? And Pedro, I wanted to direct this to you because you set up the PHL COVID-19 fund toward what goal, and how has the response reflected or considered inclusivity and equity?
Sure. Thank you, Sabrina. The PHL COVID-19 fund was set up 8 weeks ago to be the community's unified fund to respond and support nonprofits serving on the front lines, really in safety net organizations working with the most vulnerable. And we've to date raised about $15.8 million in pledges and gifts and made over $10 million in grants in about 6 weeks. And we'll probably do another more than 2 in the next week ahead. And so it was set up to deal with very immediate needs, the most vulnerable, and to act quickly. And at the same time, everybody involved are organizations and individuals that are very much committed from the beginning to inclusion and equity, but also work in organizations that and in modalities in philanthropy that aren't always there. So for us, it was very important that from, like in our respective organizations at Philadelphia Foundation, that at the governance level, at the executive decision-making level, at the program level, which is like who's running things day to day, both in the leadership and in the design, that the people making decisions and influencing decisions are as diverse as possible, and specifically with a lot of attention to making sure that in all those leadership roles, there are people that people of color, women, LGBTQ community, that we're making sure that we're having as broad a view as possible, not just in terms of background, but expertise and other things that people bring to the table. Because when you're working with the most vulnerable, people often, you know, in a pandemic scenario, you've got the health issue. You've got people who before the pandemic were vulnerable either because of age or language. And then you have a lot of people in our community that get missed because they've got so many of those risks overlapping one another. So it was very important for us that we had the right people in all the right rooms, and that at every stage we're looking for where we're missing.
So, but this is response now to the crisis. how does it inform what we create after the crisis? I mean, you said earlier to this group that even if it's powered by the cloud, the new normal is on the ground, which is a quote I like. So what does that mean exactly?
I mean, I think it means that, you know, especially in a community like this where we're thinking about impact, we often get very conceptual very quickly. And this pandemic and working quickly with to meet immediate needs and innovate real time has shown that that if you're going to have an impact, you really have to be on the ground. You have to, you know, it has the work that's happening on the ground is critical. It's not just sort of whether we've adopted a great program design that's been tested someplace else. It's about the leadership, it's about the execution, and it's about having ways real time of being able to gauge real time how you're succeeding and building momentum to address a problem, to make it better, or to find out sooner rather than later whether you're contributing to the problem.
So you're talking mostly about direct service, though, right?
I'm talking about direct service, but I'm also talking about who decides what gets measured, who decides what gets funded, who influences those things, what's the background and perspective, the lived experiences, the professional experiences of the people making decisions real time about what things get supported today and what things don't. But it's also the people running programs on the front lines, such as those people running programs for the homeless that for years have been working towards a standard that was about intimacy and proximity. And all of a sudden, social distancing inverted all that. And they had to figure out how to embed those values and that quality in a very different model. And that didn't, you know, and that really required having the mix of commitment and experience and expertise on the ground to innovate to meet those needs directly. And I think those types of, you know, those types of things that we see all the year round in the social sector, sometimes in direct service, but not always, are all amplified, both the innovation and the creativity, the ability to leverage resources that happens all the time that doesn't get seen and is now being seen, but also the fault lines in that they get magnified when so many holes in the social safety net start to fail.
So a couple of years ago at Impact Philadelphia at the conference, Sydney Hargrove from Philanthropy Network Greater Philadelphia said, I think for many years philanthropy has stayed with philanthropy, tech was over here and the nonprofits were somewhere in the middle. Now we're saying, wait, if we're going to look at this as a system, we have to have the opportunity to build relationships across those silos and reimagine together. So which silos do you feel that the COVID fund has connected?
Well, I think, you know, for starters, when you look at what the leadership looks like in the COVID fund, we literally enlisted 33 grant makers, professional grant makers from dozens of organizations, all working together, bringing their experiences professionally, their experiences with nonprofits, all collectively. So even just getting that kind of collaboration to happen in a moment of crisis rather than have silos be the impediment. On my organization, the Philadelphia Foundation and the United Way, ours is 100 years old, 101 years old, United Way several decades old. I don't know that we've ever collaborated. I mean, we are joined at the hip in the COVID-19 fund. And, you know, folks on this call could probably, you know, probably if I weren't on the call, would comment more on that. But you know, it is remarkable that our organizations, in the moment, were able to join force to partner and to stand something up that was purely responsive to community. We've done that in the civic space, urban affairs coalitions, regular partners, as is LISC, around specific things. For these two organizations to be able to do it, to enlist dozens of other philanthropic organizations. We've enlisted individuals and businesses and organizations that haven't always been involved in the community. I think it really has been a moment, that agility, that flexibility, the speed, the conspicuous nature of the need has really taught us all a lot. And I think the bar's been raised for all of us. And when we look at what the organizations on the front lines are doing, the nonprofits are doing, and how quickly so many of them have been able to adapt, expand their services with often very different models with great financial uncertainty, just raises the bar on the rest of us to do the same.
So I'd like to transition now to Andrew, because your organization really does, you pride yourself on building those relationships and bridging silos. You've also described the work you do as restorative. Can you, explain what you mean by that, and how do you see that shaping the new normal?
Sure, and I would say we aspire to be restorative and towards recovery and regeneration. Whether we'll succeed or not, I think will depend in large part by the spirit that Pedro just described and how that continues through over the next year or two. But I think our role as an intermediary is to help connect communities, like in North Philadelphia, where Michael works with the Village, communities where there are often fewer clear financial resources, but to Pedro's point, where community is made and community organizations and community organizing happens, and how do we connect them to the resources, whether they're foundations, corporate, government, to be able to achieve the activities that have been set forth by the community residents and the community organizations. And so for restorative in this case, to some degree, we were already unbalanced in terms of issues that we've called out in this panel around inclusion. I think the reason why we even sort of have this as the name of a panel is because we recognize that we are somehow have been missing the boat in terms of issues of equity and inclusion and justice. And so we see our role as how do we help rebalance the scales so that communities who are organizing, communities who are providing those direct services have a chance not only to be at the tables where the funders are meeting or where the investors are meeting, but that they also really start to be able to set those tables and be able to determine what the forms of the investments and the funding would look like. So in practical terms, we try to do that primarily in 3 areas that I think all of them are both fundamental to the issue of inclusion, but I think also as we think about recovery and restoration, I think are also the bedrocks of whether we succeed or not. One, affordable housing. People clearly need to be able to have a place to live safely, a place that they can call their home, whether they rent that home or whether they own it, a place where they can then have a base for all of the other things that they choose to do with their lives. And we've already been unbalanced and uninclusive with our housing. And I think this crisis, presents either an opportunity to create a better balance or to really fall down a steeper cliff than even we were at before. So we need to make sure that people are able to stay safely in their homes, that they are able to maintain good relationships, whether they are owners, with relationships with their lenders, with the city tax system, or whether they're renters, that they maintain relationships with the people who own their properties, their landlords, and that we make sure that those properties can sustain themselves. Because this isn't just a question about whether we allow tenants to remain in place, but somebody has to continue to pay those bills so that we maintain those roofs over people's heads. So housing is for us one place for restoration, and where we need to both create new opportunities for people to be able to live and not fear displacement, and opportunities for new forms of ownership, whether it's new opportunities for the current model of home ownership, or whether it's community land trusts or other shared ownership that allows for more collective ownership and collective stability that perhaps can help more people to weather through crises like this. And then two others, economic development. We were already working, in part inspired by work at the village that I think Mike will talk about, but how could we help where we have residents who live in neighborhoods where investment hasn't been flowing, neighborhoods which may not have as many ready-made jobs, with large employers, but where there are talents and skills and vocations that residents have. How do we help them to be able to both create their own opportunities, but also to link to the opportunities in the city and the region, whether those are with small employers, large employers, whether people are self-employed or salaried. So we had just started to do some work in parts of North Philadelphia and Kensington to connect residents and other stakeholders to exploring those opportunities. When the crisis hit, we will start to pick that up again this summer. But again, it's recognizing that we have an imbalance. We have something that is not inclusive in our economy. And this is an opportunity for us to connect community initiatives to larger regional stakeholders. And then finally, I would just say what I would call equitable neighborhood development. How do we make sure that those residents continue to be able to not only, as much as possible, self-determine, be the deciders of the investments in their neighborhoods, but how do they also start to have a voice in larger regional policies, and make sure that they are represented, not just at tables that have been set for them, but at the tables, the civic tables, the ballot boxes, the legislative boxes, and as much as possible, the economic decision-making that in large part, will constrain or open up opportunities for them. So I'll leave that alone for now, but that's sort of the three areas where we see our role is to be a bridge with other people in bridging residents and community organizations with the city and the regional decision making.
You also talk about co-designing and co-executing system solutions. So what does that entail?
So, an example is, for our economic inclusion work, a very typical process would be to have a number of stakeholders and have a planning firm that would, be the facilitator, and you'd have some residents and some business owners and some foundations and some anchor institutions and government folks. But the process would really have been designed at the planning level. And so we're trying to open that up, again, taking lessons learned from our community partners, where we have a series of residents who we will actually pay for their time, resident advisors, who will in large part be shaping the design of the conversations that will include the planners and everybody else, but it will be co-designed from the get-go with those resident advisors sort of at the center of the process, and not simply being sort of added on. It's just another part of a number of stakeholders. So I think that's one piece. And then I think the other is, to be, frankly, pretty, humble about it. We don't know where this process will lead. It's not predetermined where we have expertise that says, if we follow these steps through the design, that we will have a successful new employment initiative or entrepreneurial initiative. So in that regard, the co-design is co-exploration, where, at each step of the way, we will all determine what the next step is, and what maybe was a lesson learned, and maybe, in part, success or failure, from the previous step. And so in that regard, it's co-designed in that there is no clearly defined endpoint at the end of that process.
What about measures? I see in some of your materials that you talk about taking existing data and community generated data. Would you say that, you know, you're data informed or data driven? To what uses will you be putting
So,
that?
I mean, I would say that we are, you know, always seek to be data informed, and I think we try to remain data curious. And so to some degree, you know, we want to know what the data says. We don't want to be blindly designing or co-designing or blindly working, but we recognize that the data is going to be regenerated as we go, and the data that may come from a community process that's led by residents may look somewhat different from the data that's being generated, you know, at a regional employment data set. We need to look at both of those, but I think if we become overly reliant on one versus the other, we are likely to jump to conclusions that, again, I think will be detrimental. And I would just add, I think, one other aspect of that, which is our role as an intermediary, you know, should never be, we're in a place of privilege. We don't, you know, work day in and day out with individual residents. And so we are not sort of frontline service providers. So our role needs to be in part to provide space and support for those people and organizations who are. And we don't ever want to be in front of them and dictating to them what their action should be and be overly restrictive with funds that we are bringing to them or investors we're bringing. On the other hand, we do have the advantage, and based on the privilege I described, to be able to see what's happening in other similar communities and at least make sure we're bringing that data, even if it's just from evidence-based practice, from other places, so that each individual community is able then to say, oh, this is something that worked in West Philadelphia, maybe it can work in Hartranft, but you know what, there's some things that are specific to us here, and so we're not going to follow that exact same blueprint, but we appreciate having seen what's been done elsewhere. And I think we have that, you know, that responsibility to try to at least bring those other pieces of data based on other people's experience.
Thanks, Andrew. Sharmain, so the Urban Affairs Coalition is a fiscal sponsorship organization, and would you consider yourself an intermediary in the same sense that Andrew described?
Well, certainly we're quite similar in that we absolutely believe in and trust people who are doing things in communities on the ground, that they have a special knowledge and set of skills that we can all learn from, and that we can certainly share, so that we are all finding things that work. I think as Andrew said, if it works in one place, maybe it can work in another. But we're absolutely committed as a fiscal sponsor, as what we call a home for nonprofits, to really work with, trust, and believe in people in communities. And we think that too often what has happened previously is that communities of color, low-income communities have not been able to lead their work. They've sort of like said, here I think is the problem. We need housing, we need education. And then someone else is called in to say, okay, we are gonna come in and try to fix that for you. We actually believe, I think as everyone who's on in this meeting and a part of this effort today, whether it's Pedro, whether it's Mike or Andrew, is that people in communities know what problems are, and they also have really great ideas as to ultimately how to solve them. A lot of times what they're looking for is an opportunity to be heard and a way to partner that is going to help them to solve and work on the problems that they see.
And access to money, right? I mean, this is investment in communities of color is part of the issue. I think in that same 2 years ago at that same Impact Philadelphia session, Andrew Recklin from the Reinvestment Fund said, how do we do the thing that capitalism was supposed to do, which is to take something that looks like risk and turn it into something that generates opportunity. And you know, in lots of discussion about philanthropy, the organizations that have the hardest time getting funded are those that are considered risky, that are on the ground, that you know, that are cash strapped, small, often community based. So what aspect of the work you do you see, you know, sort of addressing that that money issue for the, and how has that changed through COVID? How do you see it in the post-COVID era?
Well, Sabrina, I think it is important for us to continue to talk about the fact that we need to get more equitable when we talk about resources going to communities of color, minority communities, minority-led organizations. Pedro, I think, really focused in on how they designed the COVID-19 fund and being inclusive and making sure inclusive voices were a part of the entire process was absolutely critical to that design. But that doesn't always happen. We worked on a report back in 2015 that I'm happy to say that the Philadelphia Foundation and the United Way helped to fund, which looked at more than 167 community-based organizations, half of them organizations of color, the others majority-led organizations, and talked with them about and looked at data to ultimately ascertain how were they doing. And what we found was that minority-led organizations, like all organizations, were doing a great job collecting data. It might have been that a lot of grassroots organizations also get government funding, which require a lot of reporting, but they were collecting data, they were absolutely showing results, but they were too often still marginalized. They had boards that didn't include leaders from the business community or leaders from other large civic organizations. And so they were somewhat isolated and marginalized. Just this month, Chronicle for Philanthropy came out with a report that pretty much mirrored the report we did in 2015, which is that we still have a lot of work to do in trusting and engaging grassroots groups because they are working on the hardest problems, which means they're more than likely dealing with the greatest level of risk. And we need to trust and bring them in the process and allow them to be able to get resources to work on problems in communities.
So in the prep for this, DJ talked a little bit about how one of the things that you've noticed for the new normal is this switch to a virtual world. And certainly, you know, for a Latina like myself and for other folks who have been covering this journalistically, we know that the digital divide has really been manifest during COVID-19, and much of the access has been really harder for some communities than for others. How do you see going forward in a post-COVID world, a virtual world that is, as you called it, a virtual world that is equitable, that doesn't replicate the problems and issues that we've seen in the non-virtual world?
Well, I think one of the things that happened out of the recession for Philadelphia, and that was the 07-08 recession. I can't believe we're just about 12 years from what we thought was the worst economic issue that was going to face us maybe in the next couple decades. But during that time, we were able to work with many people in Philadelphia to create something called the Broadband Access Campaign, and to bring money and resources into communities to ultimately help them get technology and computers, and really work in areas where maybe they hadn't been before. The Philadelphia Housing Authority, schools, training, and other places as well. It also partnered with Comcast and their Internet Essentials program, where they were rolling out nationwide a low-cost internet access campaign and process and product that people would ultimately be able to buy into. And if we sort of see what happened with the school district, as they're trying to do virtual learning, we can see that we still have more tools that need to be available. So I think we have a platform. I think we have a process that's been developed. The question is, can we reach everyone who ultimately needs it? And can we figure out how to pay for it at a time when people have fewer resources? So yes, technology is going to be critical for learning, for children, for those who are in training, as people are going to be training for new positions or new jobs. Those centers where we have all of our computers right now are sitting in our training centers. The question is going to be, can we trade some of those in so that they can be in homes where people are ultimately going to be able to use them? What are we going to do about hotspots and making sure we have as many as possible for those that don't have internet access? So yes, I think technology and figuring out how the virtual world is going to work in low and moderate income communities is going to be critical.
So I'd like to actually jump to you, Michael, because you are going to talk a little bit about the future of work. And as I see it, you know, the issues of automation and gig economy, and how those might be vectors for equity and inclusion in the new normal.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate so much what everyone has said so far, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to share. So, you know, the Village of Arts and Humanities, and I'm going to talk from, you know, like a Venn diagram of a couple of different roles. So I'm Director of Learning at the Village, but I also have been a part of the Lindy Institute for Urban Innovation at Drexel for a couple of years now, where I've been able to take my work and think about it from deeply theoretical and practice-based in that intersection. And then over the last 2 years, I've transitioned into board service and the philanthropic. And so it's an interesting kind of like mind game of jumping around sectors, but thinking about the same issues, right? Because equity and inclusion have been huge issues here for a very, very, very long time. And most of my work was, you know, done for the first 10 years of my life in sectors and spaces like public health and social services, right? And so my perspective on this, and particularly with the workforce and the way the Village pre-COVID-19, the way I was tasked with thinking about, or the way I was tasked to think about what is a workforce development idea for the future, and how can arts and media making and tech play a role in equipping people with skills that not only make them advantageous to a future workplace, but also help them, you know, personally, right? And so I set out to do some reading and understanding in that space. And I have some slides I'd like to share to just kind of help ground that discussion really quickly. And while I am getting this up, I mean, I think I'd like to say again that for me, this is very much so about humanity, our shared humanity, and understanding that so much of our humanity has actually been defined in negation, right? It's been defined in the negative spaces. And I think this conversation doesn't cross into the equity space enough, that most of our country's history of defining humanity and who gets to partake of said, you know, said fountain is based on who's been denied the rights of a human, right? And who's been denied access to the things that come with the fullness of that kind of a definition. So all that being said, to me, the first starting place was like, well, let's define how humans develop, and let me think about all the inputs that go along with that for the kind of programs we run, after school programs and pre-employment programs for young people that want to make things, whether it's a podcast or they want to make products or they want to make music, right? We have a lot of capacity to teach young people how to make and embed them in healthy and loving relationships where that making is now attached to a person, right, who can anchor down a certain kind of emotional intelligence and emotional or an emotionally intelligent endeavor, right, of growing what we would traditionally call soft skills. And so developmental science says that humans develop in a biopsychosocial spiritual aspect, right? All four components are colliding with each other at the same time. And spiritual not being religious, spiritual being this aspect of meaning making, that people are dealing with the issues of life and death at all times. And I think this is really relevant in the context of COVID-19 and all of the stress that people are under, trying to figure out how they're going to survive, or if someone in their family gets sick. We have students who have parents that have COVID-19. And so these stressors around meaning and life and death are real in general and are at the next level, I think, because of the context of where we're at. The thing about learning, my title is Director of Learning. And when I think about other roles I'm in and supporting learning happening, and we all talk about education as being a vehicle, right, for people to get out of poverty or to, grow in terms of their upward mobility and a job. The thing about learning is that learning and stress go hand in hand, right? You actually need the stress mechanism and you need stressors to learn. The problem is, and that's what we will call positive stress that you see in this slide here. The problem is that stress unmitigated is poisonous to the human body, poisonous to the central nervous system, poisonous to the brain. And really stressed out, perpetually, stressed out brains don't learn what you're intending for them to learn. They're learning what is going to either keep them safe, make them safe, or help them, figure out how to cope. And I think that's important for us to think about and recognize. Again, when we're talking about both the work of the future and how people are going to be responding now in the next 12 to 18 months with everything that COVID-19 has put forward. What I want to submit for us in Philly is that we're dealing with a unique situation around stress, because a lot of people live with chronic stressors. Going back for 2 seconds, and I'll get to that list in 2 seconds. Chronic stressors exist at both the tolerable and toxic level of stress. And what's going to make a situation toxic is literally not having enough relationships that you're embedded in that are loving and healthy and supportive for you. These are examples of stressors where no matter how much money you make, they're just still going to be stressful. Because think about parenting alone. Doesn't matter how much money you make, your kid wants your presence, right? And that is just a stressful situation for any parent. But think about children, right? Living through these situations, life is stressful. The problem we have in Philly, lots of research done on the public health aspect around adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, lots of research done around childhood trauma. We know that trauma is going around a bit unmitigated. It's a huge, huge issue for the nation, huge, huge issue for our region. Want to submit a definition on trauma for people to just take in for a second, because here's the crux of the issue when we're thinking about work. And I want to submit an idea that, in the context of an idea of extreme user design, what's good at the margins tends to be good for everybody else. Key example for us as Philadelphians is the investment downtown in redoing the corners to make them wheelchair accessible. It's better for people who have some accessibility and mobility issues, but it also is just better for everybody. It's easier to walk on, ride your bike on. You don't have to do things that might hurt your knee. The tripping or the likelihood of tripping is less. So I bring that up because we have a particular problem here where we're the most impoverished metropolitan area in the country. Stressors are high, trauma's high. People are exponentially exposed to stress. And this is a problem because when we think about the future of work and someone being fully human and developing, again, in a biopsychosocial, spiritual context, whatever, we don't think about those things as being part and parcel to each other. so that the very workforce we're hoping to be included is coming from a background that has been overly exposed to stress and trauma. Not only do we have to deal with the future of work and automation, the gig economy, we have to deal with the real humans who have been excluded and not included for a very long time. And at that social and psychological level of our development, there are stressors there that go along with not being included, not feeling included. Now let's flip from the kids that I'm thinking about in terms of education and think about employees. What's it like for an employee to not feel like they belong in a particular workspace? What's it like for an employee to feel like their safety is on the line psychologically or socially in a particular workplace? What's it like to try to develop skills in the context of that when you're just trying to climb a ladder? These are huge questions that we've not really dealt with and we've not really parsed through. And we're pressed to do it now in a new way because we literally just lost 11 plus years of job growth in 7 weeks. So this is how, and I knew we were talking to impact investors and people in philanthropy. When I think about it from a market demand space, these are the areas I saw coming up, right? People want folks, marginalized populations, to get jobs and job readiness skills. And we talk about code switching, we talk about soft skills. But the question I always had is who's focusing on the organizational culture change, right? Going back to when your employees don't feel safe in their identity in their workplace, or when students don't feel safe in and of themselves and their identity in their workplace, what are we supposed to do? And we have a fantastic opportunity now to really be considering these things and thinking about them as we're designing for the future. So what the village had to do, we took all that into consideration, threw it around on whiteboards, and I led a group in some thinking. And the first thing we did is we found this great research from Pew about the future of work that's situated that it's human skills, right? These unique human skills that automation cannot replace, that are going to be core and part and parcel to the future of work, but also right now, right? As we're making this transition to partnering with AI, et cetera, and finding new jobs in the market. The other thing that came up, if you put your attention on this list on the left, there's a lot of research that's gone into what makes a successful CEO, what makes a successful entrepreneur, right? Upward mobility was a huge concern for us. So one of the things that we did was just list all those skills out. If you look at the list on the right, remember I talked about trauma, the big thing for us was like, well, what skill sets, character virtues, what things that a person can develop in the context of relationship, what are those things that can help buffer the impact of trauma or the deterioration of one's mental health or well-being? So what you have on the right is a list of 50 years worth of research that looks at what can buffer what they call psychopathology or the deterioration of one's mental health. The fascinating things about all these lists, and I'm moving fast and happy to follow up with anybody who ever wants to talk about this. I can talk about this all day. All of these lists have the same character virtues and skill sets. They're all synonyms. The interesting thing is, depending on who's looking at it, it's not considered in one context or the other, right? So if you're looking at this from an organizational psychology, upward mobility perspective, people tend to fall on that list on the left of this slide. And they're not thinking about it in the context of the young people who are experiencing trauma and also being excluded and having to deal with navigating a workforce that might not value their identities and who they are, that also might look at them, you got to deal with bias, et cetera. So this became an interesting opportunity for us to just reframe the issue for ourselves. And this is the nature of how we've been developing our programs, is that we have marginalized and individualized communities. They are dealing with tremendous amounts of bias. They are dealing with hyper exclusion. This isn't just like, we don't want to invite you to lunch. It's legitimately hyper exclusion in the kind of jobs you can get, the kind of access you can get to school, the kind of access you can get to tools for your schooling. This is really, really intense. And so what we got from all these lists and the way that we think about, again, relationships and the way that we think about working with young people is that employers and jobs are educators of these core human skills. They're not soft skills, they're core human skills. because all of this whole list here is necessary to have a healthy relationship with your parents, as much as it's necessary to have a healthy relationship cross culture, as much as it's necessary to have healthy relationships at work, but also we got to define and iterate what inclusivity and belongingness looks like on a systems level. I don't know that we've done that in Philadelphia. I don't know that we've challenged ourselves to think about, again, the fact that humans develop in a biopsychosocial construct, and that if we don't have healthy biological inputs, healthy social inputs, healthy psychological inputs, we're not really going to get the best out of humanity, particularly at a time when the job market has been obliterated to an extent. And that we're all learners, every one of us. We are all learning ways to reconnect, connect, talk to each other. And so our programs are built, and I'll end here, our programs are built to put young people in client-based experiences around social issues. So they're learning about these social issues, working in deep relationship with master artists and master makers. They're working with master researchers in public health and population health, thinking about their neighborhoods, thinking about the city, often having to, answer a really particular question of what city do we want to inherit from the adults that are shaping it as it currently exists. And the way we ground that is in, again, this perspective that it's relationships that heal, relationships are the bedrock of how we'll learn these soft skills, and that if we want to transition them to the future, we have to be working on the relationships and defining what inclusivity and belongingness looks like. So I will leave it there.
It strikes me that that's certainly a discussion that has been taking place in the nonprofit world in terms of corporate culture, board development, and so forth. I shared a quote while you were talking from Sam Chenkin, who is the principal of Reclaim the Sector. And she says, we'll need to make space to clear and direct conversations about the experiences of people of color, queer folks, the differently abled, and anyone else who doesn't fit into the mold. We need to tolerate anger, fear, and being uncomfortable. In short, we'll need to let people be their whole selves. And she essentially wrote this in a column that that stipulates that COVID-19 may end what we know culturally within our organizations, be they nonprofits, philanthropy, and so forth, as the white professional culture. And so there's an aspect of this clearly that that is a deeper sort of work that I would love any of you to address, which is structural work as opposed to rapid relief or direct relief. And many of those structures, I think, I was reading Vourvoulias' nonprofit AF column, and he was talking about likening it to brambles. You can chop off the leaves and twigs, and that's going to make a difference. But unless you're willing to uproot the injustices that are at the bottom, what you're not going to eradicate it. So I'd like to, before we open this up, if you can quickly, each of you address what you think structurally the one sort of aspect of the new normal you see you're working to change or you see changing as a result of COVID-19. And let's start with you, Sharmain, work backwards through Andrew, Pedro, and then end with Michael.
Certainly. And again, Mike, thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation. I just want to say one of the first stops that I had when I became a staffer in the Pennsylvania Senate was the Village of Arts and Humanities with Senator Jones, and to know, again, a grassroots-based organization that a lot of people didn't know, but we felt needed to be invested in. I just want to say, absolutely, it's obvious that it is important for us to help people and connect with people at the beginning of building really some great institutions. I believe a couple of things, and maybe, I don't know if I'm answering, Sabrina, your question exactly, but one of the things that is important to me is being able to walk the talk and not just talk the talk. One of the things that I worked on with a couple of friends, and because of Philadelphia Foundation and Pedro started on the table, we started really trying to bring people together and break down traditional networks of social connection. One of the things that certainly at the end of, or when the civil rights legislation was passed and we saw the social changes that were going on in the world, certainly we saw probably the earliest changes occurred at work, where discrimination laws seemed to be a little bit better enforced than in some other places. But what we saw were that social networks tended to be people that you'd gone to school with, people that you lived in your neighborhood. And so we were doing a lot of talking at the conference table, or maybe a lot of talk in the in the cafeteria, but the idea that our social networks were still very much looking like who we were. And so one of the things that we did was to start to try to break some of those down. And I think in this time of COVID, as we look at what the world is going to look like, and we believe that we're going to have a better empathetic connection to those that we have said are most essential, I would argue that in order for that to be real, we are going to have to make sure that our social networks, the people that we talk to on a consistent basis about what this is, what this means, is not just an intellectual activity, but is something that we do every day to bring diversity and inclusion to lives.
Thanks. Andrew.
Sure. I'm just going to take one example, I guess, which is, technology, which has come up, I think, in multiple panels, and I see it in some of the chat questions. And on the one hand, we need to treat the internet and technology basically as a utility. But that, to some degree, should simply be an underlying utility that we eventually, in short order, take for granted that everybody has equal access to that utility. And everybody has the ability to have a computer with internet. But that's just the first piece of it. To go back to what Michael just shared, the tools that can be used once we have that as a utility can line up in many ways with everything that Michael shared in terms of well-being and entrepreneurship. But those are just tools, and that's not then about having the box and the wires. It's having the human connections and the ability then to use those technological tools for your entrepreneurial effort, for your creative effort, for your remote distance learning or distance work effort. But until we go and build on what Sharmain said we started 12 years ago and build sort of full equal access, we will fall short on the human empowerment and economic empowerment that those tools could bring. So I think there's a dual structure there. One, to treat it as a utility and make it ubiquitous for everybody, and two, to then make it something that we help people figure out how they work with. And that's not to be the cure-all, but just as one tangible example that we need to, I think, build ASAP.
Okay. Pedro, I'm going to ask you and Mike to be quick about your responses so that we can get some audience questions in.
Yeah, well, when we talk about organizations, we often talk about people, technology, and processes. And I think in the social sector, we've historically relied heavily on people. And as Sharmain pointed out, have in recent years focused on technology and technology access. I think the new world is, the new normal is actually that it's more about people and process, that technology is, is going to be more, not about access as much over time, but is about differentiation and how it empowers different folks differently depending upon other factors. I think for organizations, accelerating their ability to evolve processes in this acceleration of conversion to a digital world is going to be make an enormous difference for what organizations are able to sustain, what organizations are born, and what organizations cease to exist. And to beat the dead horse of people, and people matter and inclusion matters. I think as it comes down to who gets to ask what questions, who informs them, who influences them, who decides them, who benefits from them, and who tells the story. Those in terms of like what creates impact. I think on the people side, paying attention to all of those is how you get, I think, real material and authentic impact that actually benefits people in communities.
Okay, great. Mike, quick.
Being quick. So the two things. The first is we can't treat human beings like line items. And I think that speaks for itself. Budgets matter, but there is an aspect of the denial of the realities of what it takes to get the human-centered outcomes that we want. And when we organize ourselves solely around line items, I mean, you get what you get, right? On the second, and there is, I just want to put attention on something Allegheny County just did with declaring racism a public health issue. Fascinating, move, fascinating. I'm going to watch that closely. It came from a report out of Pittsburgh from an gender equity center, and the county council moved on it. And what's interesting about it is it opens up a conversation from what's considered like a social epidemiological lens to look at these inputs over time, historically, to where they're at now, to where their future projections go, to think about the ways that we now get to match budgets and operations and policies in addressing those issues. Because we can talk about trauma-informed everything, we can talk about equity, we can talk about inclusion, but it really boils down to where are those things reflected as imperatives in our budgets and in our operations and policies. So I'll leave it there.
Great. So can we field some audience questions?
Yes, and I've been seeing so many great ones. I think people are really intrigued by this conversation. So we won't have time to get to all of them, unfortunately. I think you've actually spoken to a couple, which is great, but I have one that was asked similarly by a couple of people, so I'll try to pose it in a pretty straightforward way. People are wondering how we get employers and anchor institutions to also invest and share the risk for human capital and the future of work, and how do we need to kind of change those practices and those behaviors that we've had as far as our working kind of experience goes to build a more equitable and kind of a just way of working.
Well, I'll certainly say that the coalition, we have been working with anchor institutions for probably over 30 years, very specifically in the area of construction. One of the things that communities and neighborhoods saw was that there were people coming into their neighborhoods, rebuilding Temple University or University of Penn and others, and said, we're not working on these projects. How do we ultimately get involved? And without going into all the rules around certain legal decisions around quotas and really trying to make sure that you're really looking at numbers, Philadelphia came up with a really good strategy around developing goals based on data and people who lived in neighborhoods. And so on the construction side, we've been able to do some of that work. Also at the University of Penn in West Philadelphia, they've done a better job now of identifying what jobs are open and then working with community-based organizations to specifically do a job training feed system for the University of Penn that matches people who live in those neighborhoods. So is there a lot more work that needs to be done? Absolutely. But there are clearly some models that are out there that I think that we can expand on and figure out, how do we replicate and or redesign as we look at the new world after COVID.
Great. Did anyone else want to speak to that question?
I mean, I would just point to the Job Opportunities Investment Network. It's housed at United Way, which has been engaging more in the private sector employer side, particularly around some of the questions that Mike raised around younger employees and particularly around the well-being of employees. And so they've had some early stage success with employers like Aramark and Pico to try to create not just more inclusion, but I would say a sense of well-being, particularly oriented towards younger employees and younger employees of color in particular. So I'd say it's early stage, but it is one promising partnership.
Quickly, I'd like to add, I think the other thing with convincing employers to make this investment is, you know, taking a bit of like a sales approach, the with him whole thing, like what's in it for me from their perspective. So I love to present to employers HR research that's like, listen, you are paying people 40 hours a week. Data is showing you're getting 25 hours of good work out of them on average, right? Because anywhere between 12 to 15 hours of an employee's time at work is being lost in their financial woes. And Philadelphia needs to think about what those large data trends means for it when we have, you know, a poverty rate as high as we do. So in that perspective, it's dollars and cents now. So you're either going to invest in the well-being of your employees and look at what these other employers have done when they got that data and how they had to make shifts and realign organizational culture to support the human, or you lose out on the funds, right? This is an issue of what they call presenteeism versus absenteeism. But there's a lot of data out around stressed workers, et cetera, you know, under skilled workforces, right? Or not having enough of a pipeline available to take over for the workers who are retiring, et cetera. So I would point people to go find the data.
And I'd say, you know, it's incumbent upon employers in this new world to really build the bridge with a staff and prospective staff to be able to partake of this more flexible new work world. And for us, that's meant literally, you know, in some cases, buying equipment that we, in our past policy, we wouldn't have bought. We've really set up people at home, more involved in, you know, supporting staff around their childcare needs, and really just understanding, you know, that a lot of what we think of as the workplace norms were really, you know, constructs that aren't, you know, that are sort of dated and counterproductive, literally.
I also think I just adore Catherine Garcia's tweet. She's from robinhood.org. You put your plata where your boca is. You put your money where your mouth is. You know, this is something that, you know, I think really speaks to what organizations, nonprofits have to do in a very real way.
I mean, I think one thing I can't just emphasize enough is I think we as a community, and you know, for a lot of us who've been working in the social or in or around the social sector for a long time, you understand if you're patient and you work something through enough, you see often you see progress. I think sort of speed is the new norm, and if you don't set off with clear direction in the beginning, if you're not paying attention, whether it's literally how you code something or how you structured something, good things or bad things will happen quickly. And for organizations that have to adapt cultures and all that, the habits, the behaviors that are going to build the culture have to really, and the design of it all have to start very quickly if organizations are going to be able to sustain in achieving their missions through the next couple of years. So it's really.
But I would just like to add that there are always. Sorry, Pedro, but I just wanted to add that there are always, though, going to be disruptions. I think we must always be ready for the fact that whether it is, the crack cocaine epidemic that overturned a lot of the community-based work and interventions that were put in place, and trying to figure out how do you redesign systems to deal with that crisis, whether or not it was mass incarceration, whether it was the a Great Recession, whether it's COVID and a pandemic. There are always going to be disruptions that occur, and those who have the least are going to end up being the ones who are going to be the most affected. We always have to be ready to pivot, to be able to re-examine, and be able to understand that there are some people that will make it out, but for those who don't, we cannot turn our backs on them. We cannot say it's their fault. There are disruptions that occur that are outside of their control, and it's our responsibility for those who do have the money and the resources and commitment to make sure that we don't leave people behind.
We are a little bit over time, so I want to, before anything else, thank all of you for really valuable insight. Muchísimas gracias. Each and every one of you has a very distinct viewpoint and voice, and as the editor of Generocity, I'm delighted about that, and to be able on occasion to amplify those voices. So thank you for all you do, and thank you for having been part of this panel.
Thank you, Sabrina.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sabrina, and thank you to all of our attendees. I hope you'll all stick around and join us for our happy hour after this. And then hopefully you'll all join us back again tomorrow at 12:30. We'll start for round 2.